When you think of John Hancock, you probably think of that signature, that bold, defiant flourish at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence, big enough for King George to read it without his spectacles, they said. A name so big it became slang for your own signature. But John Hancock was more than ink on parchment. He was Boston's golden boy, an heir, a smuggler, a rebel with a fortune big enough to bankroll a revolution. A man who loved freedom, loved power, and loved to be loved by the people who called him King Hancock. Tonight, we'll walk from the merchant docks of Boston Harbor to the cobblestone streets of rebellion. We'll see how a boy with a quill and a merchant's ledgers helped ignite a war, and how in the end, he died both a hero and a question mark. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave. Let's begin. Before he was a signature larger than life, John Hancock was just a boy watching the New England wind rattle through the windows of a small parsonage house in Braintree, Massachusetts. Born in 1737, he came into a world that was still just another corner of the British Empire, a string of colonies hugging a wild, dangerous coast. His father, Reverend John Hancock, was a respected but humble clergyman, the kind who spent more time among his congregation's troubles than at his own hearth. His mother, Mary, carried the heavy work of tending children and the endless chores of a colonial parson's wife. Little John was a boy who watched. He watched his father write his sermons by flickering candlelight. He watched his mother mend torn shirts, boil stews that stretched thin, and hush the small house at night. He learned early that duty came first, comfort last. But duty did not keep death from the door. When John was just 7, the Reverend Hancock died, struck down by illness and exhaustion in a world where doctors often offered more prayers than cures. In that instant, the boy's world turned from sermons and gentle poverty to questions no child should face. How would his mother manage? What would become of him? But John Hancock was luckier than most orphans. His father had a brother, Thomas Hancock, who had left the world of sermons far behind. Thomas had made himself into a king of commerce, Boston's wealthiest merchant, a man whose name carried weight in every counting house and wharf on the Atlantic coast. Thomas Hancock and his wife, Lydia, had no children of their own. Perhaps they pitied the boy, or perhaps they saw in young John a chance to forge an heir who would keep the Hancock name perched atop Boston's merchant aristocracy. So John left the simple parsonage in Braintree behind and entered a mansion on Beacon Hill. He traded patched breeches for fine waistcoats. He walked past marble fireplaces, polished mahogany, and maps of the world pinned to the walls. Boston in the mid-1700s was a city where fortunes were made on winds and tides. Ships sailed from Hancock's wharves to London, to the Caribbean sugar islands, to Africa's dark coasts. They carried rum, molasses, furs, and sometimes cargo that skirted the law when British taxes grew too hungry. Young John followed his uncle through the counting rooms and warehouses, learning the art of ledgers, risk, and profit. Thomas Hancock was more than a merchant. He was a master at playing both sides of the Atlantic. He gave generous donations to churches, built hospitals, and lent money to towns in need. But he also greased the palms of customs officials, paid hush money when his ships dodged tariffs, and made sure no British agent pried too deeply into the cargo hold. Watching this, young John Hancock learned an early lesson. Power was not just money. It was influence. It was the ability to make the rules bend like the sails on a favorable wind. He was not just his uncle's ward, he became his apprentice. Tutored by the best Boston schools, John went on to Harvard at just 13, a sign not just of his mind, but of his uncle's ambition for him. At Harvard, he studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, the classics, but his real education waited at the docks. When Thomas Hancock needed someone to negotiate a trade deal or inspect cargo, young John was at his side. When guests crowded the Hancock mansion for lavish dinners, John learned how to charm them, how to play the host, how to smile at the right moment, how to be both generous and shrewd. By the time John Hancock was in his 20s, he was already more than an heir. He was a prince in waiting for a kingdom built on oak timbers and Atlantic winds. Then, in 1764, the crown passed from uncle to nephew. Thomas Hancock died childless. His vast wealth, ships, wharves, warehouses, piles of gold coins, and barrels of debt owed to him, all went to John. At just 27, John Hancock became the richest man in Massachusetts, maybe in all the colonies. He was Boston's golden boy now, tall, elegant, always draped in the latest London fashions. He could afford silks and silver buckles, but he spent freely on the poor too, paying for food for widows, firewood for the shivering poor, bail for debtors rotting in prison. He walked the wharves as if he owned them, because he did. Sailors tugged their caps as he passed. Merchants greeted him with deference. Politicians lined up for his donations. But even as Hancock basked in wealth and popularity, clouds were gathering over Boston's harbor. For the British Empire, the colonies were growing too bold, too rich, too freewheeling with their smuggling and their complaints about taxes. Parliament wanted to tighten the leash, and the leash was custom duties, taxes, and red-coated soldiers to collect them. And John Hancock, the orphan who had learned to love freedom in the counting rooms and cobblestone streets of Boston, would find himself standing right in the path of that tightening grip. Soon enough, his signature would be more than a flourish on a ledger. It would become fired across an empire. By the time John Hancock turned 27, he had stepped into shoes bigger than any tailor could craft. He wasn't just Boston's wealthiest merchant. He was the city's walking symbol of success. Picture him there, strolling the bustling wharves of Boston Harbor, velvet coat brushing against the salt-scrubbed crates unloaded from ships bearing the Hancock name. Behind him, rows of warehouses stocked with tea, sugar, molasses, the lifeblood of New England's maritime trade. He was tall, striking, and carried himself like he knew every eye was on him, because they were. Boston's dockhands would tip their hats as he passed. Tavern keepers would clear tables if they heard Hancock was coming for a meal. He moved through the city like royalty, but a royalty of the people, not of the king. And Hancock loved the stage. He knew how to wield generosity like a weapon. He gave away money as freely as he made it. If a family's house burned down, Hancock paid to rebuild it. If a widow couldn't feed her children, Hancock's purse strings loosened. When a church needed repairs, Hancock's name was on the donation roll, always in large, bold letters. His largesse wasn't charity alone, it was strategy. Every coin spent wove tighter threads between him and the people of Boston. He became King Hancock, not because he ruled by decree, but because he ruled hearts. In an age where loyalty could not be bought outright, it could be nurtured, with parties, with favors, with a wink and a handshake behind closed doors. And Hancock was a master showman. He dressed in silks from London tailors, carried a gold-topped cane, rode in a fine carriage drawn by well-groomed horses. He hosted dinners where imported wines flowed freely, where Boston's rising radicals clinked glasses with old money aristocrats. Yet he never forgot the working man. When he walked through Boston's narrow streets, he tipped his hat to apprentices and dock workers alike. He made sure his name lingered in their mouths. A man of the people, despite the lace on his cuffs. But behind the charm lay steel. The empire had begun pressing down hard. After the costly French and Indian War, Britain wanted its colonies to help pay the bill. Parliament passed new acts, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, taxes on everything from molasses to legal papers. For merchants like Hancock, this was more than a pinch, it was a threat. He knew the taxes weren't really about money. They were about control. If Britain could tax sugar today, it could tax anything tomorrow, trade, ships, even freedom itself. So while Hancock played the generous gentleman in daylight, in the back rooms of Boston's taverns, he counted barrels and crates that conveniently dodged royal duties. Smuggling wasn't a crime to him. It was a patriotic duty, a quiet rebellion in every keg of Madeira wine that slipped past a customs official's blind eye. But the Crown was watching. Customs agents saw Hancock's ships come and go under darkness. They saw the coin changing hands at the docks. And they knew if they could bring him down, they could send a message to every merchant daring to slip around the king's taxes. So they tried. In 1768, the showdown came. British customs officers seized Hancock's prize ship Liberty, accusing him of unloading a shipment of Madeira wine without paying the required duties. The Liberty was dragged to the Navy Yard. Boston's dock workers and sailors erupted in fury. Riots broke out on the docks. Hancock became a hero overnight, the rich man bullied by imperial power, and Hancock, ever the performer, leaned into the role. He hired Boston's best lawyer, his old Harvard friend John Adams, to fight the charges. Adams argued brilliantly. The case fell apart for lack of evidence. The Crown backed down, humiliated. Hancock walked free, his legend bigger than ever. His name was now synonymous with resistance, the merchant prince who wouldn't bend the knee to a distant king. The Golden Boy of Boston was now something more dangerous. He was Boston's spark. In the taverns, over mugs of ale, the Sons of Liberty whispered Hancock's name alongside Sam Adams's. Radicals painted him not just as Boston's richest man, but as a true son of freedom, willing to risk his fortune for the cause. Hancock did nothing to quiet the rumors. In fact, he fed them. He funded radical newspapers that railed against Parliament. He gave money for pamphlets, paid printers, hired writers to keep the people angry and informed. If a patriot needed bail, Hancock paid it. If a protest needed a meeting hall, Hancock's properties were open. But the more beloved he grew at home, the more infamous he became in London. To the king's men, he was not just a smuggler. He was a ringleader, a seditious upstart who used his wealth to incite mob violence, bankroll radicals, and undermine royal authority. To John Hancock, that accusation was not a curse. It was a crown forged not in gold, but in defiance. And as the 1770s approached, Hancock stood on the edge of a decision that would turn this Golden Boy of Boston into something greater and far more dangerous to the empire that thought it owned him. By the dawn of the 1770s, Boston wasn't just a port city anymore. It was a powder keg. And if Samuel Adams was the spark, then John Hancock was the barrel of gunpowder big enough to blow it sky high. Hancock had become more than a merchant prince. He was a name that made British officials break into a sweat. He was the man who paid for the posters pasted on tavern doors, the leaflets smuggled into the countryside, the secret meetings where rebellious ideas brewed hotter than any barrel of rum. He did it all with a disarming smile and the soft rustle of money changing hands. Because John Hancock understood what many did not. Revolutions don't just run on ideas, they run on coin. The Boston Massacre struck the match. March 5th, 1770. Tensions in the city's narrow streets had been smoldering for years. British soldiers, lobsterbacks, the locals spat, strutted around like they owned the place, sent to keep the colonists obedient and the taxes flowing. That night, insults flew. Then snowballs, rocks, clubs, and finally, bullets. 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow outside the customs house, then redcoats retreating behind their muskets. Hancock saw opportunity in tragedy. He used his money to help bury the victims with pomp and fury. The funerals were protests disguised as mourning. He paid printers to splash the massacre across colonial newspapers, stoking anger far beyond Boston's wharves. He wasn't a street-fighting radical like the dockworkers who threw snowballs that night. Hancock's war was fought with ledgers, printing presses, and speeches delivered in elegant coats. But make no mistake, the fire of revolution burned no less fiercely in him than in any man who lifted a musket. He found a brother in arms in Samuel Adams. Sam Adams was Hancock's opposite in every way except one. They both hated British tyranny. Where Hancock was silk waistcoats and silver shoe buckles, Adams was threadbare coats and ink-stained fingers. Adams stirred crowds with fiery words. Hancock made sure the bills got paid when the crowds went home. Together, they made a formidable pair, the silver tongue and the golden purse of Boston's rebellion. If the Sons of Liberty needed to rent a hall, bribe a watchman, pay bail for a protester dragged to jail, Hancock's money was there. Quietly, discreetly, but always there. And behind closed doors, the Crown took notice. To British generals, these were not rabble-rousers. They were traitors in powdered wigs. Then came the tea. 1773. Parliament, desperate to prop up the East India Company, pushed the Tea Act, cheap tea dumped on the colonies, undercutting local merchants and cementing Parliament's right to tax them at will. For Hancock, the Tea Act wasn't just about tea, it was about control. If the Crown could crush colonial merchants today, what stopped it from crushing their freedoms tomorrow? So when night fell on December 16, 1773, and a group of men, some disguised as Mohawk warriors, slipped aboard 3 British ships in Boston Harbor, Hancock's fingerprints were all over it. He didn't throw the crates overboard himself, that wasn't his style, but he was the silent partner behind the audacity. 342 chests of tea splashed into the icy harbor, an entire fortune bobbing and sinking in protest. The British called it vandalism. Boston called it freedom. Retaliation came fast and brutal. In response, Parliament slammed Boston with the coercive acts, what the colonists called the intolerable acts. The harbor was closed until the lost tea was paid for. The city's economy suffocated. British troops tightened their grip. But the Crown miscalculated. They thought starving Boston would break the city's back. Instead, it rallied the colonies behind Hancock and the cause he funded. Donations poured in from New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, supplies, money, food for the hungry port city under siege. And John Hancock, the wealthy merchant who once fretted over shipping ledgers, now found himself shouldering the hopes of an entire rebellion. His fortune was shrinking as trade dried up, but his influence was growing larger than any ship's hold could carry. In September 1774, the fire spread to Philadelphia. Hancock joined Samuel Adams and dozens of other delegates at the First Continental Congress, a meeting that whispered of unity and hinted at open defiance. While Adams pushed fiery resolutions, Hancock's name and purse reassured the cautious delegates that this rebellion had money and leadership to match its slogans. When he returned to Boston, British eyes were watching his every move. The king's soldiers knew where the rebels met, who paid their bills, who to arrest when the hammer finally dropped. John Hancock's face was on every wanted list, not just for smuggling now, but for sedition, for open treason, and he wore it like a crown. The fire of revolution had been lit, and John Hancock stood at its heart, fanning the flames with every gold coin, every signed letter, every smile offered to a dock worker or a governor alike. The orphan of Braintree was now Boston's rebel king, and soon the king's soldiers would come for him in the night. By early 1775, Boston was no longer just a city under tension. It was a city under siege in all but name. Redcoats patrolled the streets in pairs and platoons. British warships lurked in the harbor like steel jaws waiting to snap shut. Every alehouse buzzed with rumors of spies, traitors, and secret stockpiles of gunpowder hidden in barns and cellars across the countryside. At the center of all that worry, at the very top of the British Empire's wanted list, stood John Hancock. To the king's men, Hancock was more than a wealthy smuggler now. He was the bank behind the rebellion, the man who turned protest into action with every shilling he poured into printers, pamphlets, and patriots' pockets. And beside him, just as dangerous, was Samuel Adams, the master of words and crowds. Together, Adams and Hancock made a pair that British generals feared more than any ragged band of farmers with muskets. One supplied the firebrand speeches that stirred the mobs. The other supplied the silver that kept the movement alive. The noose was tightening. The intolerable acts, meant to punish Boston, had instead united the colonies against the crown. Hancock, already a prominent delegate, was elected president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, a rebel assembly that openly defied royal rule. He presided over meetings in secret churches and town halls, pounding the gavel with a flourish. He approved the stockpiling of weapons and powder at Concord. He encouraged the training of local militias, the Minutemen, ready to drop their plows and pick up muskets at a moment's notice. The Crown saw all this. To the British military commander in Boston, General Thomas Gage, these weren't the actions of protesters. These were the actions of traitors, plotting to shatter the empire. And so, in April of 1775, Gage sent his troops marching west from Boston under the cover of night. Their mission: seize the weapons stored at Concord and capture the two men who lit this rebellion like a fuse. The orders were explicit: get Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But Boston's rebels had their own secret network. On the night of April 18th, Paul Revere and other riders thundered through moonlit country roads, lanterns flickering, hooves pounding frozen earth. "The regulars are coming! The regulars are coming!" Hancock and Adams were staying that night at the parsonage in Lexington, guests of Reverend Jonas Clark. They were resting uneasy. Both knew their faces were painted like targets on every British officer's map. When Revere arrived, breathless and half frozen, he found Hancock pacing in his shirt sleeves, the flame of defiance burning hotter than any fear. Hancock wanted to fight. When he heard the British were on the march, he demanded a musket. He would stand with the Lexington Minutemen, shoulder to shoulder with farmers and blacksmiths, and fight off the king's soldiers himself. But Samuel Adams and Reverend Clark saw the folly in that. Hancock was not a trained soldier. He was the money, the signature, the symbol. If he died in a hail of British musket fire on a village green, the rebellion would lose not just a leader, but its most generous wallet. Reluctantly, with a hot temper and a cold dawn approaching, Hancock was persuaded to flee further west to safety. As he left Lexington, he gave the Minutemen his blessing, and what coin he had on hand to feed them if they needed it. Hours later, on Lexington Green, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired, a ragged line of colonial farmers standing against disciplined British regulars. 8 patriots fell dead. The redcoats pressed on to Concord and found a town ready to fight back. The British were forced to retreat under a constant rain of musket balls fired from behind stone walls and hedgerows. The war Hancock had helped fund, the war his name had stirred, had begun. While the musket smoke drifted away, Hancock's name rose with it. To the British, he was a wanted fugitive. To the Patriots, he was the face of the cause. When the Second Continental Congress met weeks later in Philadelphia, Hancock arrived in style. Silver buckles, velvet waistcoat, coach, and horses gleaming. He was elected president of Congress, not because he was the best speaker or the sharpest mind, but because he was Hancock, a visible slap in the king's face. A smuggler turned statesman, a symbol that the colonies would choose their own leaders now, not bow to one crowned in London. He signed letters with the same bold flourish that would soon immortalize him. He approved commissions, wrote dispatches, bankrolled militias from his dwindling personal fortune. Some mocked him behind closed doors as vain, more silk than substance. But none could deny that his purse strings were revolutionary sinews, binding together colonies that still squabbled over almost everything else. But Hancock wanted more than titles. He wanted to command armies. He craved the battlefield glory that others like Washington would soon wear like a blue sash. But for now, his weapon was still his name, and his name was the one King George would whisper with venom when he read the declaration that was soon to come. The man the British wanted dead was alive, and signing his name bigger than any king could ignore. The wanted fugitive, the hunted rebel, the golden boy who refused to bend, John Hancock was ready for his most dangerous signature yet. When we talk about revolutions, we love to remember the battles. Musket smoke curling over stone walls, ragged men in tricorn hats standing defiant in muddy fields. But sometimes the sharpest weapons are words, and sometimes the boldest shot fired is not a musket ball, but ink on parchment. It was the summer of 1776. The world was watching, though it didn't know it yet. 13 colonies perched on the ragged edge of treason. Soldiers camped in fields from Massachusetts to Georgia, drilling with mismatched muskets, short on powder, shorter on shoes. And in Philadelphia's sweltering halls, a congress of farmers, merchants, lawyers, and one very wealthy smuggler argued, debated, and whispered of freedom. At the head of that congress sat John Hancock. He presided not because he was the keenest mind or the best orator. That honor belonged to men like Jefferson and Adams. But Hancock had something else, the aura of defiance and the weight of his name. Every delegate knew he had risked everything first, his fortune, his ships, his status, long before some colonies even dared speak the word independence out loud. He ruled the chamber with a courtly air, silk coats draped over his broad shoulders, fine stockings peeking from beneath the table, a gold-topped cane resting by his chair. But there was nothing soft in his gavel. Hancock could charm or cut with equal skill. He demanded order, demanded signatures, demanded history be made. Now. On July 2nd, 1776, the vote came down. Independence declared. It would take 2 more days for the final language to be polished like the parchment carefully drafted by Jefferson's neat hand. And when the moment arrived, when the parchment was laid upon the table, it was Hancock who stepped forward first. Picture it. A heavy wooden table, candles flickering in the stifling Philadelphia heat. Outside, flies droned through open windows. Inside, silence thick as sweat. One by one, the delegates waited. Some nervous, some resolute, all aware that this single piece of parchment was nothing short of a death warrant should Britain win the war. And then John Hancock leaned over the Declaration of Independence, the bold words that would split an empire. He dipped his quill. He did not tremble. He did not sign timidly, squeezed into a corner as if to hide. He did not tuck his name among the safer signatures of lesser-known men. He made it enormous. There, he is said to have declared, with a flash of that Boston merchant's grin, John Hancock, so King George can read it without his spectacles. In that single flourish, he captured what the American Rebellion truly was. Not polite, not whispered in back rooms, not hidden under wigs and powdered wigs and flowery language. It was defiant. It was loud. It was a dare. His signature didn't just mark his name. It put a price on his head. Every man who signed that document committed treason in the eyes of the crown. But Hancock made himself the biggest target of all. The king of the smugglers, the man the British already wanted shackled in irons, now staking his entire fortune and neck on open rebellion. If caught, he would not hang quietly. His lands would be seized, his name erased, his wealth devoured by the same empire he once traded with. His body would dangle from a British gallows, an example to every other merchant who dared to dream bigger than London's chains. And still, he signed. The declaration passed from hand to hand. Men with trembling quills added their names below Hancock's giant flourish. One signature after another, an act of faith or an act of suicide, depending on which army won the day. But none would ever be bigger, bolder, or more remembered than Hancock's. From that moment on, his name wasn't just a name. It was rebellion itself. In taverns, apprentices scribbled John Hancock on scraps of paper, testing their own defiance. Soldiers stuffed copies of the Declaration into their knapsacks. Hancock's giant scrawl, a talisman against fear on muddy battlefields from New York to Yorktown. And even after the cannons fell silent, the legend stuck. A man's signature became America's shorthand for his word, his bond, his promise that freedom, no matter the cost, was worth writing down in letters too large for tyranny to ignore. John Hancock's bold signature was not the end of his story, but it ensured his place in every chapter that came after. For when the war grew long and cold, when loyalty wavered, when debts piled up and hope dimmed, there remained that brash flourish at the bottom of the parchment, a reminder that this was not a revolution of half measures. It was all in, all risk, all name, all Hancock. John Hancock's name would forever shine bold and defiant beneath the Declaration of Independence, but the man himself still had years to live after he made that immortal flourish. And those years would prove that freedom's ink does not dry so neatly once the quill is set down. After that grand signature, Hancock did not fade into history's parchment. He remained at the heart of the revolution, the wealthy rebel king turned wartime leader, still wrapped in silk coats, but now riding through towns half ruined by British raids. His purse, once bottomless, became battered by the costs of war. His fleet of ships, seized or sunk. His warehouses, often empty. His ledgers, stained with debts rather than profits. Yet the people still loved him. To Boston's shopkeepers and sailors, Hancock was not just a name. He was the man who paid soldiers' wages when Congress's coffers ran dry. He was the face on the courthouse steps when the people needed reassurance that the struggle was not in vain. But John Hancock had bigger dreams than just paying bills. He craved command, craved glory on the battlefield that matched his legend on parchment. He longed to lead troops, but Congress had other ideas. George Washington, the steady Virginian in his blue uniform, got the title of commander-in-chief instead. So Hancock returned to Massachusetts, where his name still carried a kingly echo. There he became the state's first elected governor in 1780, winning by a landslide. If he could not rule the nation's armies, he would rule its cradle of rebellion. As governor, Hancock was both adored and infuriating. He was generous, popular, the people's champion, willing to open his personal treasury to pay for public projects, schools, and the families left destitute by war. But he was also vain, sensitive to every slight, quick to resign when insulted, only to return when the people begged him back. He loved the public stage. Parades were grander when Hancock rode through town. Ceremonies glowed brighter when his name topped the guest list. To many, it was harmless vanity, the price for a man whose name could calm riots and rally votes with a mere wave of his hand. But the burden of the revolution weighed heavy on the man who once seemed untouchable. Years of worry and travel wore on his health. Gout twisted his limbs, swelling his legs until walking became agony. At times he could barely stand, but he still rose, cane in hand, to deliver rousing speeches to the cheering crowds. His fortune, once so vast, dwindled in the years after independence. Wartime debts, lost ships, unpaid IOUs, freedom had cost him dearly. Yet Hancock never asked for pity. He knew his sacrifice had bought more than luxuries. It had bought a new country. Even as the new Constitution was hammered out in Philadelphia, Hancock hoped quietly that the people might look to him again for a crown of sorts, the first president of the United States. It did not come to pass. His health was failing, his rivals were many, and the age demanded Washington's calm dignity over Hancock's flamboyant charm. So instead, Hancock returned once more to the governorship of Massachusetts. It was his stage, his final pulpit. There, in Boston's grand halls, the boy who had once watched ledgers fill with tea and molasses now watched a nation take its first shaky steps toward democracy. In 1793, at the age of 56, John Hancock's final signature was signed. Not on parchment, but in the slow, labored breaths of a man who had given his name, his fortune, and his fame to an idea larger than himself. When he died, the city mourned as if a king had fallen. Bells tolled through Boston's crooked streets. Crowds gathered beneath black banners draped from church steeples. His funeral procession wound its way through the city he had fed, defended, and inspired. The same city that once crowned him King Hancock, when he was Boston's richest merchant. And that famous flourish he left behind, it became bigger than any ship he ever owned, any cargo he ever smuggled, any warehouse he ever built. Children learning to write their names would whisper his as they traced their first letters. Soldiers in later wars would swear their loyalty with "My John Hancock" scribbled on enlistment forms. Generations to come would sign checks, letters, marriage licenses, leaving behind their own John Hancock in ink, never quite realizing that their scrawl was a tribute to a man who risked the gallows to make a bold mark no king could ignore. Today, we remember John Hancock not just for that signature, but for what it cost him and what it bought us all. Freedom written large, defiance written larger, a single name in a nation's handwriting. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, every time you sign your name somewhere, John Hancock smiles.